Hey everyone. So today I wanted to talk a little about Chess960. There's a big Chess960 event going on. They call it something else, the GOAT Challenge, whatever. Chess960 I find to be the easiest way, but basically it's a version of chess where the pieces on the starting ranks get mixed up. It's something that I can tell you professional players like, GMs and stuff like that, we love to go over Chess960 games and play it. It can be a confusing, form for amateurs because it's so difficult to figure out how to do things. But I do find that it's kind of fun, and I think you can also learn a lot from it, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, just what things you can learn from it, right? So let's start with the starting position in chess. One thing you'll notice is that the starting position in chess, when you think about it, is really convenient in a lot of ways. Um, the the queen is centralized. In Chess960, you'll see a lot the queen is in the corner, which can be very bad. It's hard to get into the game. The knights and bishops come out into very convenient squares to control the center. C3 and F3 are great squares for the knight, for example. And I'm just looking at it from white's point of view. But in general, pieces come out in a harmonious way. Now, keep in mind, both sides are dealt the same hand. So black's pieces also come out in a harmonious way. But it makes it a little easier to play, even without knowing theory. Obviously, knowing some openings are really nice. But it gives us, the normal starting moves we're used to seeing, right? E4, of course, being a normal starting move, controls two central squares, prepares to develop the bishop, opens up the queen a bit. D4 is also, of course, very normal for the same reasons. I'm not giving you anything new. One thing I'd like to mention is that a move like this, the English, is a very normal system as well. It doesn't control the same central squares. It doesn't threaten to take out a bishop, but you can often bring the knight behind the c-pawn, and the pawn and knight coordinate very well to control the center. And you have other moves, of course, knight f3. It's worth mentioning that moves like f4 are less common because they're opening up where your king is. And things like that. So these are all kind of basic opening principles. You know them from the starting position. Then you can take moves which you know are a little less common but fine. Moves like g3 and b3. Sure, not super common. But they're very playable. You're preparing to develop a piece and things like this. So let's take a move like g4. So this is the Grob, right? There's a reason why I'm mentioning this. But why is this kind of a poor move? I'm sure there are Grob aficionados. I'm not trashing your opening, I kind of am. But the general gist is, why is this such a bad move in general, right? And the reason why is because it's extremely weakening. This pawn is now targeted easily by, notice how this bishop on c8. So for example, if you play a move like d5, which would be very logical, the bishop now targets this g4 pawn. So it makes g4 feel very foolish. It does help you develop a piece, a bishop to g2, but you could have had this with a pawn on g3 where you simply have fewer weaknesses. The pawn on g4 doesn't really serve you. It's nice in that after knight f6 you have g5, but for the most part, black can either try to grab the pawn or more commonly just play here to make sure there's no counterplay, dull the bishop, and now white has a pawn they have to defend, which should not be the case. In any case, I don't have to tell you why this is not very good, but it's something that I wanted to note. There's obviously lots of ways you can play here. I don't want to talk about the starting position too much, but I do find that when I'm talking to students and things like this, I often ask them questions in the opening very early compared to what they think. And these are students ranging from 1200 to 2200. I ask questions, and I'll get to those questions later because I want to get back to the starting position. But for now, I want to talk about Chess960 and some of the things it can teach us, like very basic things. So moving to the next position, I wanted to cover this very famous Carlsen move from this tournament. So it's this starting position. Notice how the position's totally different. The bishops are here, the rooks are here, there's a knight in the corner. So there are many reasonable looking moves here. The first move that comes to my mind, quite honestly, is f4. So notice how in normal chess, right, we wouldn't play f4, we know it weakens the king. But what's really great about 960 is it forces you to really show that you know how openings work. Because the fact is that your pieces are all scattered, they're all in different squares, and it means that the principles are not the same. You do want to control the center, of course. You want to improve your pieces, get developed. None of these things change, but the exact moves with which you do it are completely different. So a move like f4, which normally is like a slightly risky starting move, it doesn't weaken a king. It opens up a bishop and moves a pawn behind with a rook behind it, which is often a very nice thing. Notice how moves like a4 are less common because they're not central. f4 is a more central move. But a move like this would be the first one that comes to mind. What Carlsen played, which I found quite amusing, was g4. And, you know, a lot of people laughed. He actually wrote Grob on the score sheet, which I thought was very funny. But a move like this, you're like, okay, is he just messing around? Because sometimes that happens. They're just having fun. And maybe he was to an extent. But when you look at this move, it's actually a very logical move here. Number one, this pawn's not so easy to target. What's going to attack it? There's no bishop that's going to hit it. Neither of the knights can easily attack it. And then what's the purpose? It is a non-central move, which means it gets less priority. Those rules don't entirely change. But notice how, just like in the English with c4, knight c3, you're getting g4 followed by knight g3. That leaves you really coordinated. And this has some advantages similar to in c4, knight c3. So for example, if I were to play knight g3 immediately, which is also, by the way, a logical move because the knight in the corner is really rotten. Queens in the corner are rotten. Knights, pretty much every piece hates being in the corner except maybe a king. So improving a piece that's in a corner is really important, but knights in particular hate the corner. So a move like knight g3 would be very logical, and I'm sure it's fine, right? There's no way this is a poor move, but black could play something like f5, and this knight is still fairly sidelined, you'll notice. Like, it can't really get in the game too much. Maybe e4 or f4, e4 are possible. Analyzing 960 positions, everything becomes very concrete and specific after a while. And to actually figure out everything for sure is like very difficult. But that's not really what we're aiming to do. We're aiming to try to learn, you know, from these moves, right? So knight g3 runs into f5, something like this. So what Carlsen does is he plays g4 followed by knight g3. And now what he's doing is he's limiting f5. f5 is still playable, but you have to maybe get your rook out a bit early where it will get hit with a move like knight g3. And in the game, e5 was played, a logical move in the center. White plays knight g3, and now you have great control over queenside squares. Moves like knight f5 and knight h5 are occasionally in the air. And it actually looks like you've improved your pieces. Now, in the game, f6 was played, which is a very reasonable choice. But one thing that in a normal chess game, you'd be like, well, wait, I can just put two pawns in the center. What's wrong with this? How can this possibly be bad? So if you want, you can try to pause your video, ask yourself some of these questions, right? How could this ever be bad? But when you come down to it, Chess960 positions are different, right? These pawns are not as easily defendable in a lot of ways. There's no knight that's, There's no knight that's going to land on c6 or f6 to help defend those pawns. There's a lot more open lines maybe to the king. These pawns are maybe not as clear. So for example, in this position, white could play a move like f4, and all of a sudden, wait, what's going on? Moves like bishop c5 hitting the rook are possible in conjunction with knight f5. All the pieces are getting blasted open. After takes on f4, even knight h5 is annoying. The idea being you're hitting this g7 pawn, which is super awkward to defend. You have moves like queen h4 check, and at the very least, your knight comes back, takes on f4. Your rook's open, your knight's open. And this position is actually already very difficult, in my opinion, for black. Already on move, 4, whatever it is. So what's really great about playing 960 and trying to learn from it is you have to defy your expectations. You have to be able to figure things out on your own, right? Because d5 in chess would be such an automatic kind of move. And here it's actually a horrid mistake. Like, not losing maybe, but it's definitely wrong. So f6 was played, and then Carlsen actually played d4, and then life kind of goes on, right? I didn't want to analyze the whole game, but basically, they're both fighting for the center and for different squares and whatnot. So I thought that this was a fun example. Another one, which you'll find happens in chess more frequently, this is a more common pattern, is from this game. So this was between Aronyan and Kamer. So this was d4, so a Dutch, right? But again, the Dutch has, and this is a different starting position. The Dutch, by the way, has a completely different meaning in 960, of course, because there's no king that you're weakening at all. So it's a very, very different type of system. One thing I want to mention, though, is that you want to have a general plan in a position like this. So d4, of course, is not really a bad move. The knight can go behind it. Everything's kind of normal. But a move like f5 in general tends to be quite useful. And the reason for this is after c3, which was played, g6, I want you to notice how both these bishops are actually quite strong and developed, which, again, not something you see in chess very often. The bishops often have to get off the back rank to become active. In Chess960, that's often not the case. But keep in mind that in chess, you can also use these concepts because quite often your pieces, like bishops, can be good when they're really far away, right? So the need to always bring a piece out, there are times when your bishop stays on c1 in an opening and it's perfectly good because it controls a good diagonal and you don't need to move it. So these are little things you can pick up as you look at these kind of positions. But I really wanted to focus on this moment. So here, Aranyan's trying to probably go for e4 or a move like this. And Kemmer got a bit scared of this move, or for whatever reason, and played the move knight d6. So he probably should play a move like c6, trying to play e5, is I think, the correct move. What happens after this is actually quite complicated. There are all these crazy lines with e4, e5, and it's not something... It's one of those things where I usually look by myself, and then I computer check, and I see how wrong I am. But what's quite funny is that it's like every move is like totally different, and I didn't really want to get into the details too much, although it was quite fun to look over. However, c6, opening up the queen, is a very important thing. And this is something that in chess you don't struggle to get your queen out, right? But in 960 you often do, and it's a really great way to learn how to do that because there are some chess positions where you do get a queen stuck somewhere, and how to get it out effectively is really important because when your queen gets stuck behind pawns or where it can't get out, it's usually a real big problem. That doesn't get talked about as much as, not getting your queen out too early is a known stereotype, right? You don't want to do that. But getting a queen stuck can be just as detrimental, if not more so. And in 960, you often are presented with this problem very early. So Keimer played knight d6, and then you have to ask, what could be wrong with this move? Well, there's a principle, and in 960 you see it a lot, but in chess it's more rare that this happens, but it still happens, and you don't want to block your central pawns. Right? You're aware of this concept? But the question is really, why do you not want to block them? So the main reason is basically that these central pawns help stake out territory, right? And if you're unable to move them, if your opponent can get pawns in the center, they're going to naturally have control over more squares than you'll be able to because the knight blocks you. So obviously he was really concerned with e4. I do want to point this out. Nothing is cut and dry. There are exceptions to principles all the time. This is kind of don't try this at home sort of thing because these guys really know what they're doing. But the idea is that here knight d6 is, I believe, a mistake because blocking this d-pawn is actually a huge problem. And you'll see that as it happens in the game. So white played g3, opening up their bishop, e5. But after captures, f4, forcing the bishop back, queen d3, this knight just can't move. It can't get out of the way, and it hinders black from doing anything. This queen on b8 can't get out. You can't get out other pieces. You can't fix your king because the knight just doesn't enable you to be able to consolidate and control squares and do what you want to do. And this is a really common thing to look out for. And what happened in the game was a5, trying to get the rook out. This is something which you do see in chess more often now. This came about with AlphaZero and with Leela. They love to play, the AI kind of engines like to play moves like this a lot. But really, it's a developing move in a sense. He's trying to get the rook out. He's not sure what to do. But notice how he kind of has to do this because of this knight on d6. So in the game, this happened. And just to show you kind of what he... so here there was a pawn sack and life got kind of crazy. But the basic idea is that white is fully developed. These bishops are totally developed, by the way. White's ready to play e4. And notice how this knight in the center still cannot move or participate in the game, and that means this pawn on d7 can't move. It means all these pieces are stuck in the mud. So even though, of course, it was extremely complicated, in general, I really like white's chances here, and it's largely due to this central knight. Not the one on e6 so much, because it does not block a piece, but a pawn, but the knight on d6 blocking the central pawn is a common pattern that's not great. So again, these are just a few observations. It's nothing too crazy, but the general idea is that you want to try to look at these games and sort of try to learn some of these things. But you might ask, how could this ever be relevant in a real game? We don't have pieces like this. You'd be surprised. So I actually want to go back to our normal starting position. And I want to go to the most standard line there is right now. So we have knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. So one of the funny things I always ask, so this is a Spanish or Lopez, one of the funny things I always like to ask students are, why are you playing bishop b5? And they laugh at me, right? And these are like pretty strong, like, you know, expert to master level. They're like, well, I'm putting pressure on the knight. What do you think I'm doing? They look at me like I'm from Mars, which may have some validity occasionally. But then I ask, okay, but after a6, what are you playing? Now, you can play the exchange, of course. But most of them will play, all right, bishop a4. Sure, okay. So I'll play knight f6, and they're like, all right, yeah, I'll castle. And I'll play bishop b5. I'll play b5, sorry. Bishop b3, and then I'll ask, so why'd you put your bishop on b5? And it's quite funny, even very, very strong players don't have an answer to this. They don't know why, they just know it's normal. They know that these are how the lines work. And that can be enough a lot of the time. I'm not suggesting you don't learn that. What I'm suggesting, though, is you ask yourself the question. In this particular case, provoking a6, b5 is actually double-edged, because now a4 is an idea to target this pawn. The knight on c6 is often misplaced after the move b5, because it blocks the c-pawn, something you'll notice, blocking a central pawn. This one is more tolerable for the most part, but especially with a6, b5, they want to have a friend on c5, and it often will cost black time to try to fix their pieces, although you are giving up the expansion of a6, b5 for free. Right? Because you could just put the bishop on c4 and, you know, not deal with all that, and that's actually what most people do now. But I do find Lopez positions quite rich, and it's something to note. But, okay, we're talking about something else. So, this is the Berlin. So, I know that you thought it would be an unorthodox opening that I would point to, but this is one of the most common lines and, frankly, boring lines there are right now on the scene. It's the Rook e1 Berlin. Not the Berlin endgame, where you play d4, knight d6, and you go for this. And you at least get this very rich endgame, which actually is perfectly interesting, despite its reputation. There are people who play Rook e1. Knight takes e5, so we're threatening knight takes e6 check. They block that with bishop e7. And here, the main move is bishop f1. Why on earth would bishop f1 be the main move? Well, you could play bishop a4, but the bishop's not very good there, and it will probably have to move again anyway. And on f1, it's out of the way. But this looks completely harmless. You have an almost symmetrical French structure where you've traded the e-pawns. But why is this even an opening? Why do so many top players play this? Is it because they love boredom? It's possible. Not gonna lie. However, when you look at this position, what is the main problem? What is black facing? Sure enough, it's our friend, the knight on d6. This piece is so bad that even in these kind of positions, it's a big issue. And I want to point out, every single variation, you can choose a line and learn it and all of this. But if you ask yourself the core cause of every single move that you have here, it's to do with this knight. This is one of the main moves, knight f5. Why are you doing this? To fix your knight. You're going to castle, try to play d5, whatever. In this position, after d4, bishop f5, f6, rook e1. Again, the knight is a problem. So what are the main moves for black? There's knight f5, trying to play d5. There's rook e8. The idea being that after white trades, you play knight takes e8, followed by d5. All of your energy is bent on fixing that knight. That's more important than, like, you'd think b6, bishop b7, it would be reasonable. But b6, bishop b7 is so much weaker, and it's because that knight on d6 is still bad. It blocks the pawns. It makes it so the queen has nowhere to move. And it really kills black's position. So all of black's resources and what black wants to do are bent on fixing that knight on d6. That is the problem piece. And it's something where, if you see a lot of Chess960 positions where the knight lands there more readily sometimes, you learn that blocking those central pawns is almost always just really bad. And you really, it drills at home when you see some of the Chess960 really awful positions where it happens. Kind of like that one, the Iranian game we just looked at as well. So, but I wanted to show you something else. So rather than bishop f1, one thing, and I don't think I've ever played in a slow game. I faced it in a slow game, and not that I'm a huge brilliant player, but I have played it on occasion. I faced this in a slow game and got a very difficult position quite quickly, and it's something I want to bring to your attention is this move bishop d3. So it's kind of funny. We're basically like, well, if you're blocking your central pawn, I can too. But the reason I bring up this move is because we kind of have a position that to me reminds me of a 960 position. Our pieces are weird, our pawns are blocked, we can't get everything where we want. And there are lots of chess positions from different openings where this is the case. And what this has you do is it has you try to sort and organize your pieces and organize your forces in a position where your pieces aren't naturally coordinated. In so many, especially e45 openings, the pieces are naturally coordinated. Here, you have to figure out how to coordinate your forces by yourself. And what I find is that a lot of opponents are really uncomfortable doing this. But if you have some 960 experience or are just used to playing this kind of odd position, you actually have a very big edge in a lot of ways. So White's first move is more or less of it. Like, I'm going to play knight c3 to try to put my knight on, to try to play knight d5, right? So there's all sorts of ways to play. The main way for black to play is with c6. And the idea of this move is that if I try to play b3, for instance, trying to develop my piece, you can immediately slide your knight to e8 and try to get pieces out. It's still complicated. Like, there's still a lot of different lines here. You'll notice, though, that the bishop on d3, it's one of those where it looks nice and active. But because it blocks the central pawn, even if you put the bishop on b2, it's quite annoying because black plays d5 and you're unable to take central squares yourself. So it's a potential danger of this line, but you still have plenty of chances for initiative and whatnot. Bishop f6 was actually played against me. This was actually played against me in a blitz game recently. I don't play blitz like all the time, and to be fair, I'm kind of like a, well, let me try this sort of blitz player more than a, really serious blitz player, I would say. But I do find that I like to experiment with these kind of positions because it's amazing how many people just can't like function when like their pieces don't work. And this bishop d3 move was kind of cool. So of course rook e1 is a perfectly valid move, but I played rook e3. So this is a very good example of a position where it's easy to kind of fall asleep. And it's easy to think, okay, well, I'll play c6 now. What's the problem? And this is one of the other lessons that I think from 960 you get more than anything, which is that you cannot play the opening with your eyes closed. So many people of all levels that I've seen get very casual in the opening. They're like, all right, I'll get some pieces out, I'll do whatever. And they're not really paying attention early as much as they should. It's so easy to play a move like c6. But if you're paying attention, you'll realize that after this, you're just mated. Okay, you can sack the queen, bishop h4, and queen takes h4, but you're not going to survive. Queen h7, queen h8 are both threats. And you can try to mate yourself with rook e1, but queen h8 should end the game. So black could try something like this, the idea being that you're beating them to this sack, but now you have to contend with moves like knight d5, and that bishop on f6 looks horrible. Notice how, because the knight's here and there's a pawn, the pawn's not out, this bishop can't lead either. So this is already a very big problem. So in that game, and I think I maybe got the move order wrong, I was mostly showing the ideas. I think g6 was played here. So preventing bishop takes h7, sad for us. And the bishop now has a square if we play knight d5. I do believe knight d5 was actually still the best move. The idea being that if bishop g7, for instance, we can play knight e7 check. And now bishop f1, we can play d4. And if they ever attack our knight, we can always grab their bishop if we have to. And we have the two bishops. We're going to play d4, c6. It's not c3. It's nothing earth-shattering, but it's kind of nice. But I think in the game I played b3 to try to develop, right? But this was a great example where, again, it looks just like, all right, I have to get pieces out, I have to do things. But to try to coordinate here for black is really difficult. You have knight d5 you have to worry about all the time. Not after b3 immediately, right? But it's an idea that you have to contend with. I can play bishop a3, queen e2, rook e1, and I have this huge e-file bind. And again, because the knight's on d6, you can't move your d-pawn, you can't fix it. Which means that oftentimes I can tie up your pieces and it's just going to be massively unpleasant. So I think b6 is probably the best move, or one of the best moves. You could also play a move like knight e8 is also, again, pretty good. Just like you're allowing different things. Like I can play, I can play with queen e2 and try to build on this file. I can try to play bishop a3 and force d6. But the fact is that once the d-pawn moves, you're able to free yourself. So prioritizing repairing this knight is such an important thing in this position and in these positions in general. So it's a concept that you really, glean from that. But what's quite funny is black played c6 quickly, and again, blitz game, like anyone can do this, right? I could write a whole book full of my blitz blunders, or blunders in general. But the whole concept is this looks totally normal. You're stopping knight d5 forever. You're going to play knight e8 d5, knight e8 d5. Your position looks great. But you're not looking at how everything's coordinated. With the bishop on e7, and maybe my opponent actually confused their lines, this move works initially. But here it doesn't. And why doesn't it not work? There's bishop a3. So believe it or not, like black can probably sack the exchange, and like even this position's not like that easy because I play d5 and black controls the dark squares, but obviously it's never the intention, right? But notice how all of white's pieces are kind of developed, and because this knight, black's queenside is just stuck. In the game this was played and I got to have fun with this, and that was it. But again, notice how is it possible to win this fast against, I don't know who my opponent was, but I'm presuming they were definitely like a, pretty advanced player, right? How is it possible to win like this against, anyone who's knows some openings and stuff like that? Well, if you confuse the game, if you make the game kind of unusual like this, not everyone is so great at playing this kind of position. I have to admit, I've definitely had problems with it myself in the past. It's something which I always try to work on. But what I find is that if you incorporate 960 once in a while, you play it, you have fun with it, you're not trying to find perfect moves, but you learn how to coordinate pieces that aren't happy. And there are plenty of openings where piece coordination is not natural, where everything is strange. But if you become more accustomed to playing those kind of positions, whether it's from chess playing openings that are a little bit offbeat, or from 960 where you have to sort out all your guys and figure things out on your own when it's not so obvious, it can definitely help your play in those positions. And I think that it's a nice thing you can learn from watching these games, from playing it yourself, and then trying to incorporate it into your own play. So I thought that this was kind of an interesting little tidbit and note. I hope you found the video interesting, and definitely subscribe if you want to stay tuned for more. If you like my teaching style and are looking for videos, I do a link to my Chessable course as well in the description. So thank you very much, and I will see you next video.